Welcome to Irish Ghost Stories, where we delve into the eerie and spine-chilling tales of the supernatural that haunt the Emerald Isle. In this special episode, we bring you 10 true stories submitted by our very own viewers, real-life encounters with the paranormal that will make your hair stand on end. From ghostly apparitions to vengeful spirits and cursed lands, these stories prove that the world of the supernatural is closer than we might think. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, these accounts of haunted houses, phantom trains, and otherworldly encounters will have you questioning what's real and what's beyond our understanding. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for some of the most terrifying true stories ever told on Irish Ghost Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more ghostly tales. And if you have a paranormal experience of your own, share it in the comments below. We'd love to feature your story in a future episode. The Ghost in the Cottage, submitted by Clara Sullivan. I grew up in a small cottage in County Clare, surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods. The cottage had been in my family for generations, and while it was charming, it always had an eerie atmosphere. My mother used to say that the house was alive with history, but I never understood what she meant until I was older. One summer, when I was about 16, I started hearing strange noises at night, footsteps in the hallway, doors creaking, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but the noises became more frequent and impossible to ignore. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking up the stairs. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was carefully making their way to my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled the covers over my head, too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door creaked open, and I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. I peeked out from under the covers and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her face pale and her eyes filled with sadness. She didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. I was frozen with fear, unable to speak or move. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and walked back down the stairs, her footsteps fading into the distance. The next morning, I told my mother what I had seen, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she looked at me with a serious expression and said, "That was your great-great-grandmother. She died in this house, in your room. She must be watching over you." From that night on, I never saw the ghost again, but I still heard the footsteps and whispers from time to time. I came to accept that our cottage was indeed alive with the spirits of our ancestors, and while it was frightening at first, I found comfort in knowing that I was never truly alone. The Haunted Hostel, submitted by Liam Murphy. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to take a trip to Dublin. We were on a tight budget, so we booked a stay at a small, affordable hostel in the city centre. The building was old and a bit run down, but we didn't mind, it was just a place to sleep after exploring the city. On our first night, we returned to the hostel after a long day of sightseeing. We were exhausted and went straight to bed. I was sharing a room with my friend Mark, and we both fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken up by the sound of shuffling feet. I opened my eyes and saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a man, but his features were blurry and indistinct, almost like he was made of smoke. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and tried to wake Mark. But before I could say anything, the figure vanished into thin air. Mark woke up, confused, and asked me what was wrong. I told him what I had seen, but he just laughed it off, saying I must have been dreaming. The next morning, we told the other guys in our group about the experience. One of them, Dave, mentioned that he had heard strange noises in the night, like someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway outside our room. We shrugged it off and went about our day, but the thought of that strange figure lingered in my mind. On our last night in Dublin, we decided to ask the hostel staff if they had ever experienced anything strange in the building. The receptionist, an older woman, hesitated for a moment before admitting that the hostel was rumored to be haunted. She said that many years ago, a man had died in one of the rooms, and ever since, guests had reported seeing strange apparitions and hearing unexplained noises. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we finally left the hostel the next morning, I was relieved to get out of there. To this day, I still think about that ghostly figure at the foot of my bed, and I wonder if it was the spirit of the man who died there, still wandering the halls of that old hostel. The Ghostly Hitchhiker. Submitted by Eva Brennan. This happened to me about 10 years ago, and I still can't explain it. I was driving home late one night from a friend's house in County Galway. The road was deserted, and it was one of those foggy nights where you can barely see a few feet in front of you. I was tired and just wanted to get home. As I drove along the winding country road, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, just ahead of me. It was a young woman, dressed in a long coat, with her thumb out as if she was hitchhiking. I slowed down as I approached her, thinking it was strange for someone to be out in the middle of nowhere at that hour. I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Are you okay? Do you need a lift?" I asked. The woman nodded and smiled, but something about her seemed off. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and her skin looked unnaturally pale. She got into the back seat without saying a word, and I started driving again. I tried to make small talk, but she remained silent, just staring out the window. After a few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror to check on her, but to my shock, the back seat was empty. The woman had vanished without a trace. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. I even got out of the car and checked the road behind me, but the woman was gone. Shaken, I got back in the car and drove home as fast as I could. When I told my friends and family about the experience, some of them suggested that I had encountered their ghostly hitchhiker, a well-known legend in the area. According to the story, the hitchhiker is the spirit of a young woman who died in a car accident on that very road many years ago. She's said to appear to drivers, only to disappear moments after getting into their car. I don't know if what I saw was real or just my imagination, but I'll never forget that night. I haven't driven down that road alone at night since, and I still get chills whenever I think about that ghostly hitchhiker who vanished from my backseat. The Poltergeist in the Public. Submitted by Sean O'Connor. I work as a bartender in a small, family-owned pub in County Kerry. The pub has been around for generations, and it's known for its cozy atmosphere and friendly patrons. But there's one thing about the place that not everyone knows: it's haunted. The first time I experienced something strange was a few months after I started working there. It was late, and I was closing up for the night. The last of the customers had left, and I was alone, wiping down the bar and counting the till. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I rushed in, expecting to find that something had fallen off the shelf, but everything was in its place. The noise had stopped, and there was no sign of what could have caused it. I shrugged it off and went back to work, but over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Glasses would slide off the bar by themselves, chairs would move slightly as if someone had just stood up, and I'd hear footsteps in the empty pub. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. One night, after another particularly active evening of strange noises, I decided to ask the owner if he knew anything about the pub's history. He gave me a knowing look and said, "You've met our resident poltergeist, then." He went on to explain that the pub had been haunted for as long as anyone could remember. The spirit was believed to be that of a former regular, a man named Paddy, who had died in the pub many years ago. Paddy had been a bit of a troublemaker in life, and it seemed that death hadn't changed him much. The owner told me that Paddy's spirit liked to play pranks on the staff and occasionally on the customers. He assured me that while it could be unnerving, the poltergeist had never harmed anyone and was more mischievous than malicious. Despite the owner's reassurances, I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy whenever I was alone in the pub. The activity seemed to intensify when I was there by myself, as if Paddy was trying to get a reaction out of me. I'd often find myself talking to him, asking him to stop messing around or telling him off for knocking over glasses. Sometimes it worked, and the activity would calm down for a while, but other times it seemed to make things worse. Over time, I've gotten used to Paddy's antics, and I've learned to take them in stride. The other staff members have their own stories about the poltergeist, and we've even had a few regulars who claim to have seen or heard him. Paddy's presence has become just another part of the pub's character, and while I can't say I'm thrilled about working with a ghost, I've come to accept that he's here to stay. The Shadow in the Attic. Submitted by Fiona Byrne. When I was a child, my family lived in an old house in a rural part of County Meath. Their house was large and draughty, with creaky floors and long, narrow hallways. My parents had bought it as a fixer-upper, and while it had its charm, there was always something about it that felt off. The attic, in particular, gave me the creeps. It was a dark, dusty space filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings from previous owners. My parents used it for storage, but I avoided it whenever possible. There was something about the attic that made my skin crawl, as if there was something or someone watching me from the shadows. One summer, when I was about 10 years old, my parents decided to clear out the attic. They enlisted my help, and together we spent the better part of a day sorting through boxes and hauling things down to the garage. As the day wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The attic seemed darker than usual, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. At one point, I was sorting through a box of old books when I heard a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear, but the whisper was gone. I convinced myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Later that afternoon, my dad asked me to go up to the attic one last time to grab a box we had forgotten. Reluctantly, I climbed the stairs and entered the attic. As I reached for the box, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure standing in the far corner of the attic, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with no discernible features, just a silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. I screamed and ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. My parents came rushing to see what was wrong, but by the time they reached the attic, the figure was gone. They tried to reassure me that it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. For the rest of the time we lived in that house, I avoided the attic as much as possible. Even after we moved, I couldn't shake the memory of that shadowy figure. I've heard stories of shadow people, dark, human-like entities that seem to feed on fear, and I'm convinced that's what I saw in the attic that day. To this day, I'm still uneasy around attics and old houses. The memory of that shadowy figure has stayed with me, a reminder that there are things in this world we can't always explain. The Haunted Manor House. Submitted by John McCarthy. I work as a tour guide at a historic manor house in County Wicklow. The house, built in the early 18th century, is a beautiful example of Georgian architecture, with grand rooms, ornate gardens, and a rich history. It's a popular destination for tourists and history buffs, but it's also known for something else, its resident ghost. The story of the manor's haunting goes back to the early 1800s when the house was owned by a wealthy family. The family's eldest daughter, Lady Eleanor, was engaged to be married to a prominent businessman, but the marriage was not a happy one. Lady Eleanor's fiancé was abusive and controlling, and she soon became miserable in her own home. One stormy night, just days before the wedding, Lady Eleanor was found dead in her bedroom. The circumstances of her death were suspicious, and many believed that she had taken her own life to escape the marriage. Others whispered that she had been murdered by her fiancé, who was known for his violent temper. Since that night, Lady Eleanor's spirit has been said to haunt the Manor House. Visitors and staff alike have reported seeing a pale figure in a white gown wandering the halls, often near the bedroom where she died. Some have heard the sound of weeping coming from the room, and others have felt an unexplained chill in the air. One of my most memorable encounters with Lady Eleanor's ghost happened during a private evening tour. I was leading a small group through the house, and as we entered the master bedroom, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The guests remarked on the cold, and I tried to make light of it, joking that Lady Eleanor must be paying us a visit. As I continued the tour, I noticed that one of the guests, a woman, had gone pale and was staring at the bed. When I asked if she was okay, she pointed to the bed and whispered, "There's someone sitting there." I turned to look, but the bed was empty. The woman insisted that she had seen a figure sitting on the edge of the bed, a woman in a white dress with her head in her hands. She described Lady Eleanor exactly as she is said to appear in the house's legends. The rest of the tour was uneventful, but the woman's experience stayed with me. I've led countless tours through the manor, and while I've never seen Lady Eleanor myself, I've felt her presence more times than I can count. The Manor House is a beautiful and fascinating place, but it's also a reminder that history is not just something we read about in books, it's something that lingers, sometimes in the form of restless spirits. The Phantom Piper. Submitted by Hugh Gallagher. When I was a teenager, I spent a summer working at a hotel in County Donegal. Their hotel was an old building, dating back to the 19th century, and it had a lot of character. It was perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, and on clear days, you could see for miles. But on foggy nights, when the mist rolled in from the ocean, the place took on a different feel, eerie, almost otherworldly. One night, I was working the late shift at the front desk. It was a slow evening, with most of the guests already in bed. Around midnight, I started to hear music, soft, haunting notes that seemed to be coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was the sound of a bagpipe playing a mournful tune. I stepped outside to see if I could find the source of the music, but the fog was so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The music continued, growing louder and more distinct. It was beautiful but also incredibly sad, like a lament for something lost. I went back inside and mentioned the music to one of the other staff members, an older man who had worked at the hotel for years. He gave me a knowing look and said, "You've heard the Phantom Piper." He went on to explain that the Phantom Piper was a well-known legend in the area. According to the story, the Piper was a young man who had been in love with a local girl. The girl's father, a wealthy landowner, disapproved of the match and arranged for her to marry someone else. Heartbroken, the Piper played one last tune on the cliffs before throwing himself into the sea. Ever since, his ghost has been heard playing his bagpipes on foggy nights, mourning the love he lost. The music continued for a few more minutes before fading away into the night. I never saw the Phantom Piper, but I heard him many times that summer, always on foggy nights when the mist obscured everything but the haunting sound of his pipes. The guests occasionally mentioned hearing the music too, and while most of them thought it was just a local musician playing outside, those who knew the legend were more uneasy. The Phantom Piper became a part of the hotel's lore, and while I never found out who, or what, was playing those pipes, I'll never forget the sound of that mournful tune echoing through the fog. The Ghost in the Graveyard. Submitted by Christine Murphy. I grew up in a small village in County Offaly, not far from an old church with a graveyard that dated back to the 12th century. The graveyard was a peaceful place during the day, with ancient tombstones covered in moss and ivy, but at night, it took on a much more sinister atmosphere. When I was about 14, My friends and I dared each other to visit the graveyard at midnight. We were typical teenagers, trying to prove how brave we were, and none of us really believed in ghosts. So, one Friday night, we snuck out of our houses and met up at the graveyard gate. The air was cool, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind. We crept through the graveyard, trying to make each other jump by whispering spooky stories and pointing out shadows that looked like ghosts. But as we approached the old church, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The wind died down, and everything went eerily silent. It was as if the entire graveyard was holding its breath. That's when we saw her, a figure standing by one of the tombstones near the church. She was dressed in a long, dark gown, and her face was hidden by a veil. At first, we thought it was one of our friends trying to scare us, but when we called out, she didn't respond. She just stood there, completely still. One of the boys in our group, trying to be brave, shouted at the figure to leave us alone. The figure slowly turned to face us, and we saw that her face was pale and expressionless, like a porcelain doll. Then, without a sound, she started gliding toward us, not walking, but floating above the ground. We screamed and ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were well outside the graveyard. When we finally dared to look back, the figure was gone, and the graveyard was silent once more. The next day, we told our parents what we had seen. To our surprise, they didn't dismiss our story. My grandmother, who had lived in the village all her life, told us that the graveyard was haunted by the spirit of a woman who had died in childbirth centuries ago. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and it was said that her spirit roamed the graveyard, searching for the child she never got to hold. I've never gone back to that graveyard at night, and neither have my friends. The experience left a lasting impression on all of us, and we've learned to respect the stories and legends that have been passed down through generations. The ghost in the graveyard is still talked about in our village, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. The Curse of the Old Farmhouse. Submitted by Declan O'Neill. When I was in my early 20s, I inherited an old farmhouse from a distant relative who had passed away. The farmhouse was located in a remote part of County Tipperary, surrounded by fields and forests. It had been abandoned for years, and it was in a state of disrepair, but I was excited about the idea of fixing it up and living there. I moved in during the spring, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Their house was old and creaky, but it had a certain charm. However, as the summer wore on, I began to notice strange things happening around the property. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. The animals I kept on the farm became skittish, refusing to go near certain areas of the property. One night, I was woken up by the sound of something scratching at the walls of the house. I got up to investigate, but when I went outside, there was nothing there. The scratching continued for several nights, always in different parts of the house, and it was driving me mad. I mentioned the strange occurrences to a neighbor, an elderly man who had lived in the area all his life. He looked at me with a serious expression and said, "You've inherited more than just a farmhouse, lad. That place is cursed." He went on to tell me that the farmhouse had once belonged to a man who had made a deal with the fairies, promising them a portion of his land in exchange for wealth and prosperity. But the man had broken his promise, and the fairies had cursed the land. The curse had affected every owner of the farmhouse since, driving them to madness or worse. I didn't believe in curses, but I couldn't deny that something strange was happening. The activity around the house escalated, windows would slam shut on their own, doors would lock themselves, and I began hearing voices whispering in the night. I even saw shadowy figures flitting through the trees at the edge of the property. Desperate for answers, I decided to seek the help of a local folklore expert. She told me that the only way to lift the curse was to make amends with the fairies. Following her advice, I went to the edge of the property where the scratching and other activity was most intense. I left an offering of milk, bread, and coins, and asked for the fairies' forgiveness. That night, the scratching stopped, and the atmosphere in the house changed. The animals calmed down, and the strange occurrences ceased. I still live in the farmhouse today, and while I'm not sure if the curse has been fully lifted, I've learned to respect the land and the legends that come with it. The Phantom Train. Submitted by Maura Kelly. I grew up in a small town in County Kildare, near an old railway line that had been out of use for decades. The tracks were rusted and overgrown with weeds, and the station had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. My friends and I used to play near the tracks, daring each other to walk along the rails and telling ghost stories about the trains that once ran through our town. One evening, when I was about 12 years old, I was walking home from a friend's house and decided to take a shortcut through the old railway yard. It was getting dark, and the place had an eerie feel to it, but I wasn't scared. I'd been there many times before and knew the area well. As I walked along the tracks, I suddenly heard a faint, distant sound, the whistle of a train. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clacking of wheels on the tracks. I looked around, but there was no train in sight, just the empty, abandoned station and the overgrown tracks. The sound continued to grow louder, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet, as if a train was barreling down the tracks toward me. Panicked, I jumped off the tracks and ran to the side, expecting to see a train come roaring past. But there was nothing, just the sound of the train, growing fainter as it seemed to pass through the station and disappear into the night. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew the railway line had been shut down years ago, and no trains had run on those tracks since before I was born. Yet I had heard it, felt it, as clearly as if it were right there in front of me. When I got home, I told my parents what had happened. They listened carefully and then exchanged a knowing glance. My father explained that the old railway line was rumored to be haunted by a phantom train, a ghostly engine that appeared from time to time, always at dusk, and always on the tracks that no longer carried trains. The story went that the phantom train was the last of its kind, a locomotive that had been involved in a terrible accident many years ago. The train had derailed near the station, killing several passengers and crew members. Ever since, the ghostly train had been seen and heard by those who ventured too close to the old tracks at night. I never took that shortcut again, and I avoided the railway yard altogether after dark. The memory of the phantom train still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if the spirits of those lost in the accident are still riding the rails, their journey never truly over. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown, where the boundary between the living and the dead blurs, and where the past refuses to stay buried. We hope these true stories have both thrilled and chilled you, leaving you with a lingering sense of the mysteries that surround us every day. If you enjoyed these tales, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and let us know in the comments which story gave you the most goosebumps. And remember, if you've had a paranormal encounter yourself, we want to hear about it. Your story could be featured in our next episode of Irish Ghost Stories. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know when you might encounter something from beyond this world. Slán agus beannacht, and we'll see you in the next video.